Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have a historic figure as our guest this evening, Mr. Dana Beal, one of the founders of the Yippies, the founder of the White House Smokin' and the Great Midwest Marijuana Harvest Fest, the oldest marijuana festivals in the world that are ongoing and annual, are organized by or for Dana Beal. We'll be meeting with him and talking to him after the hemp news. But before we get to the hemp news, as always, we will bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, our first story tonight is out of Washington, D.C. Representative Alan Lowenthal, a Democrat from California, and 18 other lawmakers sent a letter to the United States Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, promoting human rights in the U.S.-Mexico relationship and saying that an excessive focus on arresting cartel kingpins, an approach that the U.S. government has at times promoted, has not effectively reduced violence. Also, we have seen the Mexican legislature vote to legalize marijuana this week. We have more about that in a moment. Portland, Oregon's own Representative Earl Blumenauer said he thinks a marijuana banking bill will pass, quote, relatively early in this session of Congress, end quote. Also out of D.C., Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota tweeted, quote, the filibuster is the reason we can't pass marijuana legalization. It's strangling our democracy. Also in Washington, D.C., United States Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack has signed off on a final U.S. Department of Agriculture hemp rule, despite concerns stakeholders have raised about certain provisions amid a review conducted during the presidential transition. In Virginia, Representative Bob Good, a state representative, a Republican from Virginia, sent a letter urging Virginia Governor Ralph Northam to veto his own bill to legalize marijuana, calling it a gateway drug and saying it would undermine the rule of law and expose more children to drug use at a young, impressionable age, end quote. I guess the Republicans don't understand how having kids dealing marijuana in the high school halls and junior high school halls is exposing them to marijuana use. Maybe regulation works better. I think we've shown it has. Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont said his marijuana legalization bill has a 60-40 chance of passing this year. He also said it wouldn't be the end of the world to amend it to let people grow their own cannabis. We sure hope they do. In New York, their embattled Governor Andrew Cuomo's mounting list of scandals could give added momentum to marijuana legalization that leading lawmakers are proposing as an alternative to the governor's own relatively restrictive measure. Two of those legislators spoke at a Women in Cannabis event this past Monday. To the north, New Hampshire Supreme Court this week ruled in favor of a medical cannabis patient seeking workers' compensation reimbursement for his medical cannabis-related costs. Rhode Island Governor Dan McKee and Senate leaders are expected to unveil separate marijuana legalization plans this week. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy said he thinks proposed legislation to allow police to notify the parents of minors caught with marijuana instead of arresting them is, quote, a step in the right direction, end quote. We agree. The South Dakota Senate amended a medical cannabis delay measure by reducing the amount of marijuana that would be covered under an affirmative defense provision for patients, but also to decriminalize possession of marijuana for all adults. This week, the Idaho House of Representatives passed a hemp legalization bill. In Florida, the Florida House Professions and Public Health Subcommittee and the Florida Legislature in Tallahassee held a hearing on a proposal to place THC potency caps on medical cannabis. We oppose those caps. There's this irrational fear of THC. It's never killed anybody, folks. We don't need to overregulate this stuff. It's crushing the hemp fiber, food, and fuel industry, which was the purpose of prohibition to start with. Down south, California regulators launched a This is California Cannabis campaign designed to promote the state's legal marijuana cultivation market. Back in D.C., a new Drug Enforcement Administration report argues that the broadly popular bipartisan legalization of hemp creates complications for police and has been used as a cover for drug cartels. But the DEA also admit that more states legalizing cannabis, the illicit traffic is shrinking. You don't need as many DEA agents. Imagine that. At a local level, members of the Las Vegas City Council voted unanimously to allow drive-through marijuana dispensaries in Las Vegas. And in the Midwest, the city of Madison, Wisconsin legalized the public use of cannabis, including walking down the street and in a parked car. Nationally, global cannabis sales reached nearly $21.3 billion in 2020, an increase of 48% over the previous year, $14.4 billion in sales. According to BDSA, the analytics firm, they forecast the global cannabis sales will grow to $56 billion by 2026, representing a compound annual growth rate of more than 17%. The more mature markets in the U.S. saw accelerated growth in 2020. BDSA said, noting that Colorado grew by 26%, double its 2019 rate, while here in Oregon we expanded by 39% in 2020, 18% more than the 2019 rate. Medical and adult use markets that launched or started in 2019 and 2020, like Florida, contributed $1.6 billion in spending in 2020, with $422 million in medical cannabis sales and nearly $1.2 billion in adult use sales. As promised, our story out of Mexico, lawmakers in two key committees in Mexico's Chamber of Deputies amended and approved a Senate-passed bill to legalize marijuana on Monday, setting legislation up for a floor vote action. Members of the Chamber's Health and Justice Committees approved the cannabis bill in a joint vote of 34 to 11 with 12 abstentions. Lawmakers made several significant revisions from the version that passed the Senate in Mexico last November. To the dismay of advocates, the bill was also changed to include a provision requiring that people who want to grow their own marijuana at home will have to register with the government for approval to do so. Hopefully that will be omitted out. Next story is out of Tel Aviv, Israel. Cannabis use mitigates chemotherapy-induced naturopathic pain, according to data published in the journal Therapeutic Advances in Medical Oncology. A team of Israeli investigators assessed the effects of cannabis on chemotherapy-induced neuropathy in a cohort of 512 patients with gastrointestinal malignancies. 248 of the participants received cannabis treatment, and 265 subjects served as controls. The authors reported that the use of cannabis both mitigated and, in some instances, prevented neuropathy. The researchers noted that pain mitigation was more significant in patients who had received cannabis prior to their treatment with chemotherapy, suggesting a protective effect, end quote. The authors of the study concluded, quote, chemotherapy-induced neurotoxicity is a profound adverse effect which, according to the results of our investigation, may be mitigated and prevented by cannabis treatment. A randomized, placebo-controlled trial of cannabis use in a setting of chemotherapy is being planned to further investigate its potentially important neuroprotective effects, end quote. Several prior clinical trials have previously documented that cannabis mitigates neuropathic pain in various patient populations, including those with HIV or refractory pain conditions. This study, Effects of Cannabis on Chemotherapy-Induced Peripheral Neuropathy Among Oncology Patients, a retrospective analysis, appears in this month's edition of Therapeutic Advances in Medical Oncology. Our last story tonight is also a medical one out of Baltimore, Maryland. Neither the past use nor the current use of cannabis is independently associated with an increased risk of hypertension, according to data published in the journal Drug and Alcohol Review. An international team of investigators from the United States, Canada, Germany, and Russia assessed the relationship between cannabis use and hypertension in a nationally representative sample. Participants were restricted to those who did not possess hypertension as a baseline, and their health was monitored for a 3-year period. The researchers reported, quote, after adjustment for all co-founders, neither lifetime cannabis use, 12-month cannabis use, nor less than 12 months cannabis use frequency, at least monthly use and less than monthly use, were associated above chance with the incidence of hypertension, end quote. Prior data has shown that cannabinoids may influence blood pressure and other cardiovascular responses, though these effects tend to be short-term in duration. Most recently, Israeli data reported that elderly subjects with hypertension respond favorably to medical cannabis treatment. Investigators involved with that study concluded, quote, cannabis treatment for 3 months was associated with a reduction in systolic and diastolic blood pressure as well as heart rate, end quote. This study, the longitudinal relationship between cannabis use and hypertension, appears in this month's edition of Drug and Alcohol Review. That's the end of our hemp news segment tonight. If you or a loved one are looking for a physician, a doctor, who can help you get a medical marijuana permit in your state, we have referrals to medical marijuana doctors all across the United States. Call our office if you have questions about medical marijuana, marijuana legalization, or anything to do with cannabis. Call us here at the Hemp and Cannabis Foundation. Our phone number is 503-235-4606. That's 503-235-4606. Now we have our interview with Dana Beal, a legendary activist and one of the founders of marijuana prohibition activism here in the United States since the 1960s. Stay tuned and help us restore him.
I would like to introduce veteran activist Dana Beal, who has been a marijuana legalization activist since the 1960s and worked with Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin with the Yippies. I first saw you, Dana, at the White House smoke-in 1978, the day before the smoke-in. There was something called a bust-in day in front of the White House. It was back when Jimmy Carter was president. It was quite a scene. So, but let's go back to the beginning, Dana. When did you first become a political activist? When did you first try marijuana?
Well, I actually was a kid, involved in the civil rights movement. I hitchhiked to the I Have a Dream speech when I was 16.
Ah,
And the
1963.
slogan was, like the sit-in, right? It was another one of those things where we're just going to park ourselves and do civil disobedience and dare them to arrest us.
Mhm.
And the actual initiation of the sequence started with a mescaline trip. We were making our own mescaline. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. No.
We were making mescaline on the kitchen stove.
Oh,
Actually,
So-
most psychedelics, if you extract them from plants, it's very easy to extract them.
okay.
You can, however, damage them, so it depends on what, but mescaline's pretty stable. So we were making mescaline, and then we were tripping on mescaline, and then we were coming down, and we were walking up the street, and we looked to our left, and there in front of the 9th precinct was what looked like a riot. It transpired the cops had arrested a bunch of people for having a picnic on the grass.
So
And
you're
they-
talking about New York
On
City.
grass, they were just having a picnic on the grass, and they were arrested for it. And that upset people very much. So there was a very loud, angry demonstration in front of the police station. And
This is in New York
we
City.
got sucked into it. You know, we were coming down from a trip,
Okay.
and
So,
and
so,
that led about 3 days later to us doing a free marijuana event at the very first Grateful Dead concert in New York City, which was at the Bandshell in Tompkins Park.
when was that?
Morning, in fact. Um, well, that was January or June 1st, 1967.
Okay. So you were probably about 17 or 18 then, or
Well,
you must have been, what?
I was 16 in 63. By
Okay.
1967, I was 20.
Okay. And so Tompkins Park, Ninth Precinct, is that in Greenwich Village in New York City?
Well, that's what's called the East Village.
Okay.
The village proper is across Broadway. It's on the west side of the island. Broadway kind of separates the island into east and west.
I see. Okay. So it's now 1967. You participate in this, and it was,
Well, it was
tell me
a big success. People loved it, and so we did it the next week, and we did it for a few weeks until we kind of ran out of weed in the beginning of August.
uh-huh.
And the very next thing that happened was they sent a informer around who wheedled me into like giving up my personal stash of LSD to him, and he was representing a narc.
Ah,
So I got the still got the New York Times article, but they spelled my name wrong.
so that was your first
500
arrest.
people, 500 people marched across town to free Dana Beal.
So
And
1967, the first free Dana Beal event.
yeah, and then I the next thing we did was that Abby Hoffman was so impressed by the fact that we could get big groups of people out, and he'd done some parades. Actually, Abby Hoffman was doing a parade on St. Mark's Place, and there, standing on the curb, was Ed Rosenthal. And I said, "You should join us." And he said, "I guess I will." And you know what Ed asked now? When are we going to have to stop marching?
When
Oh,
did he say that?
well, that's what he said more recently. But the point is, you know, a lot of stuff got started in the summer of '67, and kind of what happened was then Abby asked me to put on the smoke in at the Pentagon, and we brought 4 pounds of weed and gave it out in joints to many kids who had never were from the Midwest, who'd never actually smoked a joint before. And
Is
that's
this
kind of when the marijuana movement took over the anti-war movement.
so? This is where the Pentagon was going to be levitated.
Well,
A
we did
hundred.
when we smoked those joints, it levitated.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And there's also a really famous picture from that where some kid is putting a daisy or something into a
Yeah,
national
yeah.
member's rifle barrel. Rifle barrel.
But then right after that, two things happened. One, I got busted for something I didn't do and freaked out and left town. But before I left town, Abby asked me to join the Yippies. So I was actually invited into the Yippies in January, I think it was January 8th of 1968.
I see.
Before it really even got going. And then I
Yeah.
left and I didn't participate. I didn't go to Chicago. I didn't get back into the Yippies until I hooked up with the White Panthers. But during that time, I went to Canada and I hung out in Canada for a while, and then I came back, and I ended up in Milwaukee, which is where I met the White Panthers. And I went to a White Panther meeting in Ann Arbor, and they put me on the White Panther Central Committee as field marshal, because at this summit was a group called the Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers.
Uh-huh.
And they knew me and they spoke highly of me, so I got the job. And right after that, there was a meeting at Tom Forsad's loft in New York in December.
Yeah, and for
Where
people who don't, Tom
they,
Forsad founded High Times Magazine.
right, but he hadn't yet. This is, I don't even know if he'd even taken over the Underground Press Syndicate yet, but he had a loft already. And it was on 17th Street. They had a meeting and they restarted the Yippies because the Yippies had kind of gone into hiatus after Chicago. They thought, after the police riot, maybe they should keep their heads down. But they got indicted anyway, and there's a big trial going on called the conspiracy trial, which Sacha Baron Cohen has now done a movie about.
Yeah, yeah.
And
There's been a
in the middle of this, they reformed the Yippies and merged with the White Panther Party. So I got into this new organization being on the Central Committee of the White Panthers already. Okay. Now, here's where a very interesting story, I may not have told as a sequential story before, unfolds. And that is that I went to Yale, of all places. I went to like New Haven. And there was a big rally there because Bobby Seale had been indicted and claimed that he ordered somebody to be killed, which he didn't do, but they claimed it. And so there ended up being a big thing, big affair on the Yale Commons, right? And all the people from the trial that had just occurred were there. And they each had their personal following. So you had Rennie Davis standing over and giving a speech, and you had Jerry Rubin, and then you had Abby. Abby was very popular. Now, at this time, I didn't know it, but a few blocks away, Allen Ginsberg was meeting with the guy who did the politics of heroin in Southeast Asia, Alfred McCoy. And he had all the information about the CIA and the scam. Actually, they had, by this point, gotten really, the war had been going on for 4 years, and they gotten really established there. And now people were able to fly in. The head of the mafia from, I think, Florida, Santo Traficante, flew in and started a big pipeline of bringing heroin to the United States from Vietnam. And all this information was being passed on by Allen Ginsberg a few blocks away when I was meeting Tom Forsad.
I see.
For the first time. And he had that Cadillac tricked out as a stage that's in the Medicine Ball Caravan. And, he'd heard of me too. So, my notoriety, was definitely greater than my fortunes at that point. And so right after that, we had the Kent State and Jackson State.
Right, the murders by the National Guard troops.
People were in shock, and a lot of people said we'll never be able to do demonstrations again because it's over. The kind of zone of tolerance that we had before, where we could, have mass peaceful demonstrations and maybe act up a little around the edges, is gone. And they're just going to shoot people dead. Now, there had been a call by a guy named Eddie Arrow to do. Maybe I can find it here. Actually, this is something that even you have never seen, Paul. This is the. This is the. Yeah. See.
What does it say at the bottom?
This is the original White House smoke-in poster. It was not done by us. It was done by a guy named Eddie Arrow, who had some benefits at the Electric Circus on St. Mark's Place. But what happened was that Nixon announced he was going to do Honor America Day in exactly the same place. And, you know, what this meant, of course, was that if they had the permit, they could simply say, you're not allowed to be here. And they would cancel our demonstration out. So there was a meeting in Ann Arbor of Abby, Jerry, and representatives of John Sinclair. And they couldn't figure out what to do. They were just, you know, like the deer in the headlights. You know what I'm saying? And it was this whole thing of we can't do anything because we'll get shot. Well, me and AJ decided to do it anyway, and basically I was the field marshal. So if nobody else can make up their mind what to do, the field marshal can still marshal the, you know, the mass of people to do something. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So you
couldn't figure out what to do. The field marshal's in charge, and they couldn't figure out what to do. So I decided to do it. And what we did was we recruited Rennie Davis to work with the Quicksilver Times. And he announced on national television, there's a big problem. Nixon is calling this thing, but at the same time, there's a smoke-in that's been called, and there are people coming like the Up Against the Wall motherfuckers and the White Panthers, and we think it's going to be a rumble. So we think, you know, we need to have peacekeepers in the middle, a line of peacekeepers to keep the two sides apart, right?
Okay.
They call it the Committee to Prevent a Fist Fight, and this went on national television. So naturally, everybody was going to come, even though, you know, it had been called off. And we got there the morning of the event. We had joints pre-rolled, a couple of actually, we had like cigarette packs, right? Pretending that they were cigarette packs of cigarettes. Crazy. But we got there, and seemed like there were very few people around until we broke out the joints. And then all of a sudden, hundreds of people materialized out of thin air. And somebody said they're busting people down at the reflecting pool. So the whole crowd that we'd assembled by giving out free weed went off, you know, from, I guess, maybe north of the spire of the Washington Monument, around to get to the reflecting pool. You go about 3 blocks west, and there, like at the reflecting pool, was a line of cops halfway down the reflecting pool to keep us away from Honor America Day. Now, Honor America Day was kind of pathetic. You know, they had Bob Hope, they had like actual movie stars, but they only had about 4,000 people because they only covered the area immediately at the bottom of the steps and the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Okay.
So what they did was add this cop line, keeping us away from them and stopping, you know, counter demonstrators from disrupting, you know, the speeches and stuff. And what happened was people leapt into the reflecting pool and marched down the reflecting pool, the whole crowd of us.
Yeah.
Chanting 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your fucking war. And basically shut it down. We shut down Billy Graham. We shut down McIntyre and the whole gang of Nixon supporters. And this was such a trauma to them, Paul, that
Yeah.
50 years later to the day when Donald Trump had his speech at the Lincoln Memorial,
Yeah.
they built a whole fence across the reflecting pool to keep the phantom crowd from 50
Remi-
years earlier, you know,
Repeating.
from like disorganizing, disrupting, and discombobulating their demonstration.
That's pretty interesting. I didn't realize that
Oh
you
yeah,
got the reflecting.
there's
This was
certain
at
there's certain common threads like Roger Stone that
uh-huh.
continue the whole time, and they have what's called institutional memory.
Right, right.
So they were really convinced we might show up and do it again. But
I
Nixon was so traumatized and convinced that the Democrats were orchestrating the anti-war protests
uh-huh.
that as a result, he ordered his people to break into the Watergate because of this demonstration. So, in some ways, this demonstration was even more effective than the Chicago demonstration, but we don't get credit because there's some people who say the Yippies had by that time, see, because there were still a few people who said the Yippies had been disbanded. So, even this new big organization, Yip, had been started, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, these other people said that it wasn't legitimate. Now, there was always splits like this in the movement, but there were only like a couple of them. And what happened was a year later, me and Forsad did a demonstration where we did a repeat of the smoke in, and we did an anti-CIA heroin march.
Uh-huh. So this is in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, like 1 year later, in 71. And 10 days after that, I was arrested in Madison, and everybody believed, even though it may have just been an accident that I was arrested at that time at that place, that it was retaliation for doing a demonstration against the CIA smuggling heroin into the United States.
I
And
see.
I stayed there in jail for a long time, for like almost 9 months. And they had the first smoke in Madison, the one that became the one that Ben does, right?
Yeah, the
The
great
one that
Midwest.
you go to, right? That very first one was in September of 1971, and it was a free Dana Beal.
I
So
remember
anyway,
that.
I continue to do stuff from inside the Yippies, and I said we have to go to the Democratic Convention and bring up the issue of the CIA smuggling heroin, because how can they have a war on drugs when mostly what they've done is just cut off the pot. So the only thing that will be available to the freak on the street is heroin.
Mm-hmm.
So it's obviously, they're just trying to damage the hippie movement as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I did get out and I went to Miami. I got a
So this
regular
is
Miami. And
1970.
sure enough, I wound up questioning McGovern on national television, and he confirmed that there was, in fact, heroin dealing going on, and that the Nixon administration was running interference for it. But he did not actually campaign on that because his people were so upset about drugs being mentioned at all. And people will not remember this now because it's 1970 is 50 years ago. But acid, amnesty, and abortion were used against McGovern by Nixon, who, of
Yeah.
course, crushed McGovern in the general election. So maybe he shouldn't have like stayed away from the drug issue, because trying to avoid talking about it didn't help.
No,
The
no, he
only
was.
problem was that there were people working for him then. Hillary and Bill Clinton were a couple of young volunteers working for McGovern who were traumatized, and later in the 90s kind of wanted to stay away from the drugs issue as much as they could. They thought
Yeah.
it was bad for the Democrats. And this is in the middle of the unfolding of medical marijuana, AIDS, and all that other good stuff. So anyway, now as the time comes to a pause, and you can ask me, Dana, what happened next?
Okay, Dana, what happened next? So 72, you're in Miami, you're at the Democratic National Convention, you confront McGovern. McGovern lost overwhelmingly in that election. I think the only bigger win was Reagan beating Mondale 15 years later, 16 years later.
But he did it because you had these anti-communists in the Democratic Party, Hubert Humphrey, who basically told everybody to go vote for the Republican. That McGovern is a pinko, and we can't be having that. So vote for Nixon. And they actually told people to vote for Nixon, which is, you can't do anything when that's happening. But people did continue to demonstrate, and the thing was, the Watergate problem didn't go away. It kept getting worse. And eventually Nixon had to resign, and the anti-war movement ended up just being a impeach Nixon movement, because the war kind of wound down.
Yeah.
And there were two wings of like the yippies. There was one that wanted to stay very pure, focused on the war. And there was another that was, the Forsad wing. They called them the Zippies, which were more into like, well, they were into the drug war as an issue, but they were into psychedelics and marijuana. We started a paper called the Yipster Times. I mean, they had a lot of time. They had the Mobster Times and the Monster Times, so we started the Yipster Times. And right after that, Tom Forsad started High Times.
Yeah.
So we're kind of in a symbiotic relationship with Tom Forsad and High Times.
Yeah.
And I was getting weed from Tom, helping him fund his magazine and funding my magazine. And he was recruiting people who work for Yipster Times to go work on High Times. And then they'd get a raise and everything.
They get paid. Yeah.
But kind of the high point of it all was really like under Jimmy Carter. And if I had to do the whole thing with Jimmy Carter over again, I would do it completely differently. Anyway, what happened was, in August of 1974,
That's when
Nixon had resigned.
Nixon resigned. Ford became president in August of 74.
And a week after the resignation, me and Howard Lotsoff, who's my friend from Brooklyn, who Ed Rosenthal introduced me to, were talking about the most far out psychedelic drug we'd ever done.
Mm-hmm.
And I said it had to be ALD 52, because I just done ALD 52. And ALD 52, you can think of it as a more psychedelic form of LSD, that's all.
Okay.
Now I said, no, it was Ibogaine, because I took Ibogaine and it got me off heroin overnight. And I didn't immediately react, but it's the cartoon where the light bulb goes off and the voice below next to the guy's head.
Yeah.
I'd gotten a lot of trouble for asking McGovern about the CIA heroin. People blamed me, not Eagleton. They blamed Dana Beal for Nixon being elected at all. And here somebody tells me the answer to my question, which I asked McGovern, if, we have millions of people smoking pot, and our own government is supplying the heroin. How are we going to keep these people from being exposed to heroin? He didn't have an answer for that, but Howard did. Because what we had was we had a drug which, no matter how fast you addicted people, and it takes a while for people to, bounce around the drug scene and now wind up on heroin. We had something that could get you back off. It was like a reverse gateway effect. And it was obvious that the marijuana movement should have immediately settled on that as a strategy, but we didn't.
Mhm.
And it was a terrible thing because, in the White House under Jimmy Carter was a guy named Peter Bourne. And Peter Bourne was one of these addiction doctors from Britain who was into the heroin maintenance as opposed to methadone. So he would have been very interested just scientifically because the actual physiological effects of ibogaine are very interesting in themselves. It has anti-Parkinson's effects. But we didn't do anything then, and we didn't do anything. Let me see. We did the Bring Abby Home benefit. Abby Hoffman had gotten himself busted for for 3 kilos of beet coke. It was all lidocaine, but he got busted and he was on the lam. And we ended up doing a big event that got him off life sentence with just 8 months in rehab.
Mhm, mhm.
So that was a pretty big victory. But then Tom Forsad killed himself.
Do you think he really killed himself?
Yeah,
Or do you think he was off?
he piloted his best friend and his pilot literally into a tree with a big load of weed and all burnt up. And he came back from Florida, was very, very depressed, and before he could kind of get over it, he killed himself.
I see.
So what happened was there was a group at High Times that was like doing heroin. About, according to Gabrielle, maybe as many as 20 people, but probably more like a dozen. They were in the art department. They were also working part-time in the art department of the Village Voice and another paper called the Soho Weekly News. And, these are the kind of people who were like doing kind of punk fashion shoots, you know. And they were, well, they had a place they hung out down on Grand Street. And I knew those guys. I like knew everybody because I was, mid-level weed dealer, at that time. I did once actually sell 1,000 pounds of Colombian for Tom in 48 hours, but that was right before Jack went into a tree. And actually, it was Jack who. That's Jack O'Lantern, not Jack Herrera.
Yeah.
Jack O'Lantern drove me around with the weed, and we delivered it. See, so he was not only the pilot of the plane, he was the driver of the van. Bad guy to lose in an accident. So these guys at High Times got the brilliant idea that they would like promote heroin through something called heroin chic. And the argument is kind of like it's inevitable, doing marijuana leads to heroin, and it's inevitable you're going to end up trying this anyway, so you might as well try it now and see if you like it. And maybe I can sell you some heroin because these people were also selling heroin
I see.
to promote their, own use. They had to pay for what they consume, so they had to sell more than they were taking.
I see.
And so they wanted a big store cover of High Times about how everybody is now doing heroin.
Mm.
Well, we stopped it, but it was bitterly resented. And that was because all the people in the print side of the magazine were old New Left guys from the underground press who remembered the Vietnam heroin thing. And I said, we're not going to promote this. Cocaine is one thing, But heroin is like a lot more serious. You can do a few lines of coke and it won't kill you. But you do heroin, you're going to end up being a junkie. Well, that's led to like various kinds of bad vibes, conflicts. I won't even go into the whole story, but after some protests against heroin chic, we sat down on the second floor of 9 Bleecker Street, me and Howard and Norma, his wife, and we decided that everything else was just kind of like public relations, but that if we actually made a medical cure available, that would make a difference. So we started the Ibogaine Project. It was kind of a bad time to start it because Reagan had just been elected, but he hadn't been sworn in yet.
I see.
On the other hand, to develop a drug takes a long time. It took us 8 years.
Hmm.
And think of all the stuff that happened. They had the Contra cocaine scandal, which once again, the government was dealing drugs to support some black ops that they couldn't get Congress to pay for.
Right.
And this big thing called AIDS happened. Now, if I had it to do over again, I would have started making marijuana brownies in 1982 and delivering them in person.
Hmm.
And people would remember me as like a brownie Mary,
Yeah.
Practically a religious figure, but they don't. And neither did the Pope of Pot. We could have used him for that.
Uh-huh.
Instead, we worked on the Ibogaine, and we get to the end of like the decade. Um, how Jack is doing like the first versions of The Emperor Wears No Clothes.
Yeah. I first saw it in your newspaper. What started as Yipster Times was renamed Overthrow by the time I saw it. And that's where I first saw Jack's work, was that there was the CMI white paper in Overthrow.
Right.
Jack,
but you
what
see,
became-
it was even like it was another story, which was it had to do with this black hash. It was very good black hash. It was gold stamp. Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
It was cobble.
Yeah, it was Afghani hash. I remember that. Those
Yeah. And
bricks.
what happened was I had developed a pretty good New York connection. And once again, I was able to like sell a lot of something. And I ended up having a box left over. So I gave it to Jack. And see, there was a book which we were trying to get published called Von Hemp is to Read, which means when the subject is hemp. So my guy, I went over to Germany when the Greens got in. Went over there and I said, well, if they have Greens, they got to like be into marijuana, right?
Mm.
And I met this guy, Hans Georg Baer, who was the most interesting guy, one of the most interesting guys I ever met.
Really?
And he was the one of this book. He came over, he tried to peddle it through High Times. High Times didn't go for it. It was probably better at that point than what it became into, but we started translating it and we got it halfway translated in kind of a Cliff Notes version. And then this thing happened with the initiative in Oregon. Was it 1985, that initiative?
Yeah, we put it on the ballot in 85. We were cheated off the ballot in 82. I met Jack in
Was
82.
it 86 that they did the actual vote?
Was in 86, yeah. The first,
Well,
it was the second vote.
that was 86 was when I got the black hash.
Yeah.
Right. And Jack says, I'll take the translated parts of George's book and the white paper and put out a tabloid. And we'll put the tabloid on every doorknob in Oregon. Like you can print up a tabloid and put it in a plastic bag and put it on the door. And so they did this 3 times. And Jack could show you figures that people's attitudes changed once they got the information that, this devil's weed isn't just this like noxious drug. It's actually this really useful plant. And maybe, just maybe, they're exaggerating all the bad things about it anyway.
Right.
So anyway,
Yeah.
that
Every
came out. That came
everything
out in
that was dropped in
that came
OMI.
out, and then subsequently he made a book out of it called "The Emperor Wears No Clothes,"
Yeah.
and that came out in about '88. And I tried to get some stuff in that, but he didn't really want to use the stuff I had. He determined that it was not um, material to his argument. It was stuff about nylon and DuPont. Maybe it wasn't really, but when they did ban um, marijuana under the Tax Act, one of the arguments they had was that we're not really going to need it anymore for fighting wars, which is, if you go and look at George's book, that's the reason Napoleon invaded Russia,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
So we're going to be able to do it with nylon, and guess what? Nylon shocks, so it gets brittle and breaks. And George Bush, Poppy, right, Senior,
Yeah.
when he parachuted, when he was shot down, he had to use a harness and a parachute made of hemp
Yeah.
because the nylon wouldn't cut it.
Hemp saved his life.
That wasn't enough. That wasn't enough to make it into the book. And right at that point, I decided I would start working on Ibogaine, because I said, I'm not even getting credit for this. And I goddamn went over, found the book, and gave it to Jack, and he's not even putting my name on, up with his. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I said,
Right.
I'm gonna write this time I'm gonna write the first book, and I called it the Ibogaine story. But
Well,
what happened was,
we're about out of time, so we'll
no,
have to do it.
I'll wrap it up. What happened was that we went down to the 4th of July smoke-in and gave out a thing saying we're going to storm NIDA for Ibogaine, and we freaked them out. They thought they were going to have 1,000 people there. So they got the head of like the new medications development to come down and talk to us. And this, I think, is in 1990, but it might be 91. They ended up starting a program to study Ibogaine for treatment of crack cocaine, because they had nothing to treat crack cocaine.
So Dana, we are out of time, unfortunately. We're going to have to come back and do more later. But
I can come to like Portland at some subsequent time, and we can sit down in the actual studio.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Come on.
I'm sorry this history is so long.
You have so much more history to go through here. We've got up to like the
1990s.
early 90s now.
Oh, no, I will tell you though that when it was discontinued at the end of the program that they had, which was 95, 96, it was discontinued by the manufacturers of today's Suboxone. So what they did was they created a panel, and they put industry representatives on the panel, and they gave industry reps one more vote than the NIDA scientists. All of the scientists wanted to continue work, but the people from this maintenance therapy, what they were going to like replace, their plan was to replace methadone with this, and they pretty much have.
And they're still doing that with the psychedelic treatments here, right? They're still.
Well, what they did was they got two laws. They had the one to do the clinics. That's one law. That's for psilocybin. And then they had another one, which was the decrim law. And under the decrim law, they take money from this fund that was established under their earlier cannabis law that they passed in 1914. This money is built up to do drug treatment, and instead of going for Ibogaine, of course it's going to go for Suboxone.
Yeah. Well, Dana, I want to thank you for coming on the show. We'll have to have you back. Tell me when you can come to Portland, and we'll do it here, but maybe we'll do another one online sometime.
All right.
But anyway, this is Dana Beal, very historical figure, as he's outlined. I want to thank you.
White hair.
Yeah, I remember before you had white hair. Mine's turning that way too. But anyway, I want to thank you for coming on, and thanks for working for marijuana legalization and freedom and help restore hemp.
Yep.
I don't know, Jack. It reminds me of another fellow I was telling about running for governor. He said, well, I'll be for you or against you, whichever helped you the most. Any government that tells you that the solution to a present-day problem is doubling the prison population over the next 20 years has its head stuck where it's never going to discover the 1,000 points of light of George Bush. My opinion, these people's idea of future full employment is to make half of us prison guards and the other half prisoners. This man is an alien. He's not a conservative, he's an alien. He and Ronald Reagan both. They are willing to imprison a whole generation of people to keep intact the petrochemical and pharmaceutical monopolies in this country, of which he's well vested in each. And I think he's a vampire. I don't think he's an American. I think he's a vampire willing to suck the life out of all us victims in order to remain powerful in a powerful position. But let me take this opportunity right here. Wherever this gets shown, let me tell you something. I am pleased and honored to be in the presence of one of the most brilliant men in the United States.
This gentleman next to you,
Jack is author of Emperor Wears No Clothes, and so much more than just an author. A researcher and a dedicated and diligent activist, and a man who I know for a fact is responsible for tens of thousands of people in this country being able to come out of the closet and stand up out of the darkness, and stand up out of oppression and despair and lives of quiet desperation, and be able to point to the source of knowledge and the truth and the point of light that this man right here is personally responsible for putting together. I would not be where I am today were it not for Jack Hare, and I know that a lot of people would not be walking tall and with dignity and a sense of pride and a sense that they do no wrong by communicating with Mother Earth through the herb and in other fashions. And this man right here is responsible for as much of it as I know of. I'm sure other people deserve credit who have helped him out, but this man right here is one of the most brilliant people in the United States today, and I hope someday that this country and the people in it will reward him appropriately for what he's done for freedom and individuality and civil liberties and Mother Earth in this country. I want to take that opportunity right now.
Does that mean I get free grass for the rest of my life?
No, I was going to ask you. Hell no, I got to make profit, son.
I'll do the rest.
Books, I got to start robbing you.
Here, let me show you something you can take back and we can give you better photos. This is Mr. Henry Ford in 1941 with Popular Mechanics magazine showing off his car made from hemp.
Oh, is that when the whole car itself was made from hemp?
And it says so right there in Popular Mechanics, 1941. Is that nice? One more nail in the car. That's an irretrievable. They should have never let us find that one.
Oh man, that is right now. This is not the case of a blind hog snuffing out an acorn every once in a while.